Hey, this is Boaz. Thanks for showing up. Please visit the Fools and Sages podcast at foolsandsagespodcast.com. There are no spaces and it's all spelled out. You can find show notes, references, bios, merch, and other cool features. Contact us if you have feedback or a question, if you want to appear on the show, or if you want either or both of us to be a guest on your podcast. You can listen and subscribe on Spotify, YouTube, Rumble, Apple Podcasts, iHeart Podcasts, and anywhere else great podcasts are found. And follow us on X and Instagram. Support us on Patreon. The Patreon link's also in our website. And thank you. Enjoy the show. Good afternoon, Brian.
Good afternoon. How you doing today?
I'm doing all right. We haven't talked or we haven't recorded in a little while here. I have a new baby, and I'm doing the usual sleep deprivation.
Yeah, some big changes with the new year here.
Yeah, and you have a new pack of dogs.
A new 3 babies, yeah, and that were just arrived by. They were just abandoned behind the house in town, and so I didn't see them coming, nor did I plan for them. But I'm deciding that I could probably sleep on a 2x6 now. Because as puppies, of course, our house is cold, so they wanted to sleep on the bed, and so that's worked out okay, at least in the excremental factors. So
So that's
stealing
the fun
covers, that's another issue.
life on a ship.
Yeah, yeah, kind of. And also, I've been took me a while to adjust because they have the dog ball mentality, and I just watched the finishing of the first year's sumo championship, where they actually named a new yokozuna, which is doesn't happen all the time. There's usually only a few alive at any time, and whenever they interview the champions, they always say, "Well, I just have to do my sumo." To do my sumo, and not play his game, but my sumo. And so I realized that in dealing with the dogs and stealing the covers and everything, I wasn't playing my sumo. I had to get my game on, and now I'm doing better. But there was a learning curve there with the.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but they're part mastiff. It seems like so that it's rapidly going to outgrow this chapter. So
Yeah, yeah, that's
yeah,
a big investment, it turns out.
yeah, and I don't know. We may need to raise livestock. That's the only way I see forward now. But
Yeah,
you never
or
know. There's always that unknown factor, and which is part of the thing I've been thinking about is
I
humans
was
and the
going to ask
unknown.
you,
Yeah.
what's been on your mind lately?
I just I think the big thing that's been on my mind was interesting has just been the stirring of the pot that the podcast has been doing in my head, and I just did the show notes for our conversation with Claudia from St. John's, the tutor from St. John's, and having to do with our one of our upcoming ones with her. She had expressed an interest in a philosopher that was a student of Martin Heidegger's. And so I've started to try to recover some of my familiarity with phenomenology, and so I've been reading most recently a guy named Gadamer, who was a student of Heidegger, who really expanded this idea of hermeneutics. Uh, but the idea is that this does sort of move in a direction because a lot of these characters that came out of Heidegger, they really started focusing on discourse and the function of discourse. And for these guys, it's a lot more than just having having a conversation. And the way that Federico Fagin spoke. I was just listening to one of his things. He was saying that whenever you have the exchange between two quantum systems, that something new is always born.
What's meant by two quantum systems?
Uh, well, there's a whole fascinating thing about that. That is the historical conversation about is reality basically deterministic, and by deterministic we mean there's this fantasy that if we had all the numbers and we could crunch all the math, we could determine everything that's going to happen. That attitude is applied to nature, it's applied to the universe as a whole, it's applied to humans. And so in the physics search for going down to these smallest particles, the idea is, can we flatten this all out into a mechanistic sort of a thing? And the corresponding conversation that goes along with that is, therefore, is consciousness basically a phenomenon that comes out of these mechanistic brain chemicals, these things that are fundamentally dead and unaware? Do they have some sort of a clever relationship that consciousness and awareness, this idea of an I, Freud used the term das Ich, the I, is that just an epiphenomenon? Is that just something that sort of happens as a result of all this mechanism? And so that school of thought is sometimes referred to as reductionist materialist reductionist, something like that. And so I just read this fascinating book that just came out not that long ago by David Bentley Hart, called "All Things Are Full of Gods," quoting Thales, the ancient guy who they claim as the first Greek philosopher,
Hmm.
actually. And that, we, amongst a number of things he addresses, is consciousness reducible to mechanistic, clever billiard balls, to just dead things interacting? And does life come out of that? And then does consciousness come out of that somehow? Which we described as the dust, then back to dust,
Hmm.
as opposed to Finnegan falling off the ladder and then waking up again and coming back to life. Uh, this idea of spirit, from spirit back to spirit. So, so that's one of the argument that these. What's curious about this is now the physicists are checking in, and what happens is, so how does consciousness, how does free will come out of this? Well, we have to understand that intentionality or free will are very connected with consciousness. Consciousness, we aren't just passive and have the universe just flow into us. Uh, I mean, sensation, we might say, flows into us, but understanding, we actually have to reach out to understand something, just to say that or this. Some element of us has to reach out. And so this idea of intentionality is very connected with the witness or the I that peers out at reality, so to speak. So uh, the idea is, where, from whence does that arise? And is it reducible to just material things? And of course, the traditional classical description says no. All things are full of gods. This, but uh, this classical expression that we've associated with Descartes, of "I only want to know what I can scientifically verify," that's turns out to be only one mode of going about things, and that's where the door to hermeneutics, because we know intuitively, I think, that there's something wrong with that, and we spoke about it before in terms of, if all meaning has to be meterable, measurable, translatable to numbers on some measurement, uh, then what do we do with uh, uh, Beethoven? What do we do with Raphael or Michelangelo? can we say that there's no meaning in that? That doesn't seem correct, right? So that sort of swings the door open to this idea of hermeneutics. And
I'm, I'm curious before um, making the pivot to hermeneutics, what would the steel man be for explaining Raphael, Beethoven, Michelangelo? Is it just that like the emotional experience is an accident of consciousness, and so we can, artists can play on that, but it's not real in the sense that the mechanistic universe is?
right, and that consciousness and meaning and all the currency of consciousness is an epiphenomenon that sort of happens when you get a complex system. And of course, the people that are building AI, they're trying to follow that path. They're saying, "Oh, when we attain the singularity, it'll be the same as if it's conscious." Well, it's like, no, it won't even be close to that because it can't have intentionality and it can't have self-awareness. And so Fajin, actually, who is the guy that we mentioned, who invented the first commercial processor, CPU, who also invented the touchscreen. So he may have invented the device you're holding in your hand if you're listening to us. Um, he wanted to figure out, consciousness, and then he said he had a realization that math was the product of consciousness. So he couldn't use consciousness, or he couldn't use math to figure out consciousness. There's a sort of a bootstrap problem there. And but after, I mean, really, this is a guy that solves problems in the material world. And but then he had some realizations that are quite, quite world changing in their perspective, and that sort of shifted him into the fall then the rise model. That which is to say that consciousness or meaning or mind, which just has very interesting implications to language, is fundamental to material, to matter, to existence, which echoes the first words of the gospel according to John in Arche Logos. In the beginning was Logos. The pattern, like, and he pointed this out in what I was watching today, and that is that we understand some mechanisms about about how a cell functions, and we might even be able to reproduce little parts of that. But what we don't have is the coherence. We don't have what makes a cell cohere and function as a cell, which is that logos, you could say. And so that's also is a way into the hermeneutical process, is this sensation of, or this concept around coherence. Because we don't just have awareness, we don't just have intentionality, but we have a coherence, which is to say that we're not just a collection of capacities, which is what an AI is, right? It's just a buildup of a bunch of switches that are either on or off, and they have no knowledge of the whole system that they're part of. So there is no coherence. They're purely parts. They are not whole parts or part wholes.
Is coherence essentially the state of being a holon, the state of being a whole and potentially a part of a greater thing?
And I think perceiving in wholes, which gets into the hermeneutical circle.
Okay, if you want to lay that out a little bit.
Well, the foundation of hermeneutics comes from the Greek word to interpret. And, we often when you study philosophy, you will study language. And so, you study other languages than your own language. And usually you study some of the original languages that some of these philosophies were written in. I was trained in Latin and Greek and was supposedly trained in French, though mostly it didn't stick. So, this idea of interpretation, I think it first really became focused with spiritual doctrines, spiritual documents. And it's like we have this thing that's written in an old text, and uh, how do we know that we're actually getting the real meaning? Because Okay. No internet connection. Oh, that's what you mean.
Hey, so we had a little hiatus there. You lost your internet up on the mesa, and then my daughter came and visited for the weekend. So here we are a couple days later, and you were about to explain hermeneutics for the layperson.
Right. And luckily, nothing's changed in the past 2 days regarding hermeneutics. And I should specify, maybe, uh, I realize sometimes because I always listen to our episodes afterwards to pull the show notes out, and sometimes I'll realize, I coulda, shoulda, wish I had dropped in another adjective here and there. So, for example, in our conversation about modernism and postmodernism, probably we should have introduced a distinction between philosophical postmodernism, cultural postmodernism as applied to art, as applied. So there's a lot of different things that were in that basket, and I didn't really maybe make that clear. And with hermeneutics, there is the same similar distinction. Uh, the original hermeneutics, um, just to reprise from what we had started, the original hermeneutics comes from the word to interpret, and so it comes from translation. And I've heard hermeneutics described as the art and science of not misunderstanding. So originally, when we just say hermeneutics, what's typically implied by that is hermeneutics around a particular text and trying to get the closest to either the truth or the original meaning intended by the author. There's some conversation there. Uh, Out of that text, and what are sort of the rules and the ways we go about it, and how do we avoid misunderstanding. So this was originally hermeneutics as such was created by a German philosopher. I think this is what we were just getting to when we lost connection, by the name of Schleiermacher. And so he was a theologian, and he was applying it, of course, to Christian theological texts. And then you had, some history went on. The guy that I've been reading lately has been this guy. This will be backwards, but it's his name is Hans-Jörg Gadamer, who was another student of Heidegger, who folks who have been listening to us might recognize that name, phenomenologist. And so Gadamer talks about philosophical hermeneutics. And what I find interesting about it is and I said before that all these different philosophical systems, they all sort of have their little insights that they build around. And so you might find that a whole philosophical system doesn't ring to you clearly, but certain insights that it's built out of might be very useful, and they might be worth taking along, even if you don't become one of those, as it were.
Can you clarify what, like the study of understanding either what is intended or the deepest truth in what is said or written?
Right.
How is that different from rhetoric,
Ah, well, because I think it's focused on the reception and rhetoric is focused on the delivery.
the transmission?
Uh,
And can you give an
Rhetoric is
example of what is there to hermeneutics? Like, so I'm listening to what you're saying, and
mhm,
I'm making a million assumptions about what the true meaning of what you're saying is.
right,
Maybe for one thing, it's a little like squaring the circle, right? Like,
right,
I might never fully comprehend the full truth of what you're saying because it's coming through you with your foot nailed to the floor the way your foot is nailed to the floor and being heard by me with my foot nailed to the floor,
right.
right? So that there's an
That's a
unavoidability.
hermeneutic assessment there, right there.
But like, how far can you take a conversation about that then? Or like, is this
Uh,
wordsmithing, or
well,
is there something else to it?
there's some interesting stuff that comes out of it, and that we can apply in the sense of as philosophical hermeneutics, not just textual hermeneutics. And I think it happens, the insight that I think that's interesting about this, that sort of plugs into some other very interesting arguments that we've talked about before, um, is this idea of the hermeneutic circle. And the hermeneutic circle is basically, the way I would put it, it's an understanding of the function of consciousness that is tied up with that relationship between wholes and pieces, which we've spoken about before, right? So what does that mean? It means I pick up a text. So first, one of the first hermeneutical insights is that before I even choose this text to say, I'm going to take this to try to get some truth out of it, I already have in my semantic world a picture of what that text is about as a whole. And it's built on maybe the picture on the cover. It's built on maybe the author's name and everything that I've heard about the author. It's based on the people that I've seen carrying this book around. It's based on all the things about the book that didn't involve me actually reading the book. And so now I have that, if we might call it an imaginary whole of this work. But we know that it's not anywhere close to what we're after because I haven't read the book yet. I've just formed this loose set of assumptions. Now I pick up the book and I read the first sentence. Now this you can apply even to the first word. This is so the way this works. I read the first sentence and now immediately, as part of a seamless process, my picture of the whole of the book is altered a little bit by that first sentence. That first sentence has now started to specify what was only a series of possibilities in my head, you might say. So now my understanding of that part that I read, that first sentence that I read, it was influenced by my presupposition of the whole because I was reading it as a part of that whole. But now that I've read it, it has slightly altered my picture of the whole. I mean, and what's a better example of that than Finnegan's Wake, right? And that first sentence. Because right away I'm thrown into, like, I've heard about Finnegan's Wake, its reputation precedes it, and now boom, I'm in the middle of it, and I won't really understand that sentence until the last sentence in the book. So he's playing hermeneutical games with us, right? The job of how will I understand Finnegan's Wake and not misunderstand is that's like the classical hermeneutical task, right? In a literature sense. You can go ahead.
So, this seems to me like the sort of insight that you have the first time you drop acid, or when you're staring at the stars one night and you realize, like, I can't, like, I always have preformed suppositions. Those are always refined by the information that
Right.
I'm processing. I guess there's like where I go with that. If it comes up, say, on a trip, a psychedelic trip, is that's noise. Like, that's not important.
Which part?
The understanding that I am always filtering information that in some way
Is
there's
incomplete
a
or is
yeah, that
right,
there are
right.
constraints.
Well, that's not the insight here, though.
Okay.
This is where the insight starts, because what happens is now I've begun a feedback loop, and that is the hermeneutic circle. And that is, now I'm going to read the second sentence. Now I get another installment that tunes me in a little more on the whole, and my picture of the whole is altered again. And this process of feedback goes back and forth, and it goes back and forth instantaneously. Because you've noticed, you've read books, but you've never caught yourself like I don't believe I have, stopping at a sentence and saying, okay, now I'm going to update my picture of the whole, right? We have a sense of wholeness, of cohesiveness. And that sense is something that comes along with our consciousness. When we get into the conversations of how mind works, like in all things are full with gods, uh, that's where this idea really starts to take root. Uh, uh, what consciousness brings along with it. So now what happens is once we recognize this hermeneutical circle, we're in a totally different world. And let me point out how different a world that is. Uh, in the world of science, in the world of facts that are established either to be so or not to be so, or in the world of science, for example, that measures things and given a unit will come up with a number to represent a reality that's incontestable. If you use these units, you will be able to reproduce my experience when I say this thing is 8 inches long. Here's the ruler, here's the object. You have your experience with the object and the ruler. You should come up with exactly the same uh, conclusion that I come up with, incontestable. But with this hermeneutical circle, what happens is, okay, my image of what that whole was that gets updated through the hermeneutical circle was exactly created by all the where my foot was nailed down, all the experience that I brought. In other words, my subjectivity actually becomes a critical part, not my objectivity, my subjectivity, what I bring to it. Now, how do we bring this real? When a person looks at a piece of art and you look at it when you're young and you look at it when you're old, what you can get out of it is going to be more when you're old, unless you've brain damaged yourself. And the reason is because the cognitive world that you can bring to it is so much richer now. And depending on how you've spent your time and your space and your mind, it will be more or less richer. And therefore, the amount and the quality of the meaning that you can extract from that fact is actually multiplied by the richness of your subjective content, which is exactly the opposite, right? It's exactly the opposite. In the scientific world of meaning, we don't want anything colored by our personality. And in fact, there are in the attitude that we've talked about, the Buddhistic idea of right view, we don't want to color things that prejudice us in a non in a what's the way I want to say it,
Bias?
because you know what I'm after, right? And we don't want it to take us further away from meaning.
Right. Or truth. Yeah.
But here it's like we need to get the truth out of this thing. We need to resonate something inside of ourselves so that we can recognize it. And if that thing is not inside ourselves to be resonated, we won't get it. And so like hearing a national anthem, if it's a song you've never heard before, it's not going to have an emotional reaction to you like it does if it was the song that the bagpiper was playing in the trenches when you climbed, like that. There's different associations you bring to it. So this idea of ourselves not as contaminants to experience, but as collectors and distillers and reverberators and test tube vessels for all of this subjective experience. And this kind of plugs into Fajin, and why does the one want to know itself? Or when we spoke earlier, why did the universe think you when it you'd you? What did it want out of you? It didn't want your objectivity. It wanted your subjectivity. the richer the richer your experience to distill meaning out of life, the more you're fulfilling the one in experiencing itself. That's would be the Fagin's one consciousness idea. And I think it's very close to other things we've talked about. But the idea is that it's your subjectivity is your non-repeating, non-algorithmic, non-ending decimal signature. And
So
and that's hermeneutics.
yeah. So I don't know if this is a rabbit hole worth going down, but I'm struck by the sort of paradox of, you know, Buddhism or Eastern philosophy in general having this idea of that the more conscious we are, the less biased we are about perceiving reality truly for what it is. And that seems to be oriented paradoxically with this idea that we have a subjective view of the world that's basically all bias. And we're continually updating the quality of our bias.
I'll accept that as long as you say as long as bias isn't purely negative.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah,
Absolutely. But that's really the point. If it were all negative, then I would be saying getting rid of bias so that we have right view. But I'm not. I'm saying updating. I don't know a better word than bias that doesn't have that negative connotation. Um, but it's like discrimination doesn't have to be negative, but it sounds that it
right.
sounds negative.
Exactly, exactly.
But but what about this paradox um, between right view and the only view is subjective? Do those meet at some point because we're able to achieve such a refined subjective worldview that it perceives reality in its purest form? Is that the idea?
I think that's the evolution of the self.
Okay.
I mean, and that uh, there's this idea that enlightenment is escaping everything that's to do with subjectivity and the dirtiness and all that. And it's to be in this high world of, angels singing in beautiful colors and this idea. Well, there's a famous Zen master, I believe, or Taoist master, where they were asking him where exactly is the Tao? And he says the Tao is in the very excrement. I have a feeling he wasn't. He was using more euphemistic terms, right?
Was he? Did he have three puppies, or did he have a new baby when he when he came up
Exactly.
with this?
It's exactly it. There is nowhere that is not Tao, right? And but it's in that particularity, right? It's a joke of the general on the expense of the particular, but there's a purpose to that particularity. And that
There's a
sorrow,
purpose to the joke.
there's a purpose to the joke and there's a purpose to the sorrow. And that's why we have a skull and a rose, right? On the Fools and Sages logo, on the Fools and Sages logo, right? They're both there. And so because they're an essential part of of that formula at that level where it shows up as duality. I think that when we go back to the Tao and we lose that tuning, which, you know, many theories say we don't lose it, we just go off of the display until we reemerge on the display, but that the computations in the processor are going the whole time, to borrow the CTMU idea. Um, but so we don't really want to escape humanity. We're not going to escape falling off the ladder, but we give our attention to waking up at the wake. But we had to fall down the ladder, if you will. And
Right.
that's why, or we couldn't wake up. Right.
Yeah.
And
So So a couple questions, and these might be interrelated enough, so I'll throw them both out there. One is, if we take as a premise that the process of updating our model is the process by which the self is realized, meaning is grasped, etc.
Individuation.
Individuation occurs and merging occurs, I'm sure, right?
Right.
Both the
Both.
yin and yang.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, the, then the obvious question is, what have humans come up with as the most efficient way to go through that process, or what are ways to think about going through that process more efficiently? And before you answer that, here are my two questions. One is, I'm thinking of Ken Wilber as having spoken to this maybe more comprehensively than other people I'm familiar with, but I haven't read a lot of stuff. So I'm thinking the four quadrants represent a framework for hermeneutic development. And also that a framework like clean up, wake up, um, show up, and whatever the fourth one is, also represent such a framework, also Wilber. And then I'm also wanting to make the connection back to dialogue or discourse as a refinement mechanism, which seems highly imperfect because it's so broad. But
Hmm.
what are your thoughts about, like, we're in a hermeneutic process whether we choose to be or not? So how do we drive that machine as efficiently as possible?
Yeah. I mean, I think that my personal conclusion is that life is a hermeneutical process, not an analytical one. We have to change gears. We need to know how to take meaning from a thermometer, but also from a painting by Raphael, or a song, or a sunset, or all of those things. And the most efficient way, I mean, it just stirs up a lot of associations. Uh, Here's the most random one. Okay. When I was very young, I met an interesting and strange person, and he introduced me to what he called the mind matter integration equations, which he had come up with. Now, this was a guy who was super smart, but super smart doesn't always come with super stable. And basically,
Or as, or as you sometimes say, pretty isn't everything.
pretty isn't, yeah, pretty doesn't help. Yeah. And so he had this approach to what he did was he took the periodic chart of the elements and he multiplied it through a formula of his. I'll leave it at that. And he came up with what he called Jacob's ladders, which was a series of steps. And if you're familiar with the periodic chart of the elements, you have this idea of valence, right? To the left or to the right. And in the zero center column is where we have, reprising Plato's Republic, copper, silver, gold, right? And then as the valence goes one way or the valence goes the other way, we get other elements out of it. So he basically comes up with this by multiplying, by doing his psychomath on it, or psyche math, let's say. Yeah. He comes up with this number, and I can't remember exactly what the number is, 118 or something like that. And he says there are 118 steps on Jacob's ladder. And I thought, well, that's all great and all well and good. And then I read some while later the Vijnana Bhairava Tantra. And I think Devi is talking to Shiva or someone like that. And they're praising the value of this work, which is a series of tantras, of yogic methods. And one of them is saying to the other, this thing is so wonderful. because within this, there is a method for every human being that ever was, is, or will ever be. And here's these methods, and there's like, I don't know, 118 or 100, whatever the number was. It's the same number that he had through doing his math process, implying, and it's like, well, how could one say that there's a method for every human
It's
that
got to
would?
be 128, not
Yeah,
118.
I'm
It's
so
got to be
unsure of the number.
264s, right?
We'll just leave it blank for now, or go search the Vijnana Bhairava Tantra, and that was the number, right? So, and you can probably Google that now. Al might know about that, and so that gave me pause. I'm like, whoa, well, maybe consciousness. So we have this idea of that center column, and we have this idea of valence, and we have this idea of the Sushumna, the central column, and the Ida and the Pinglala that are associated with the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. And in his model, there was this idea that when a center was balanced out left and right, then the energy could go up to the next level. And it could be way off to the left, way off to the right. But when it came into zero valence, then it could move up to the next level. And so that gets applied to the body. And the idea that each one of these chakra levels is a qualifier of energy or a transformer of energy that feeds up the system to the next step up level. The idea that these different places in the body, this plugs into Reichian therapy, have to do with the openness or closedness of that center and its ability to move energy. So that if you think of a human as these different energy centers that can be open or closed in various ways and to various degrees, you get all of the formations of the human psychoenergetic system. And there are this many possibilities. And so the idea is that based on where that is, there's going to be a particular iron in the golf bag that's going to hit that ball exactly right. So there's an interesting structure for you. Now, can I give you much practical information out of that? Only by translating it into those other methods. By saying we know, for example, that in human development, and this plugs into one of Leary's books, where Leary talks about these different circuits. And he applies it, like Wilhelm Reich does, to a psychological, a psychosexual developmental agenda that moves from birth to a fully developed human being, with the idea that culture will bring you up so far, and then because culture hasn't completely fulfilled its journey, once you get up to culture's level, if you want to evolve any faster than the culture, you're going to have to now get out in front of the pack by opening circuits that might not be open amongst the masses of people. And I think Wilbur shares that idea also. And this is just the bell curve. This is not
Yeah.
anything radical here, right? But so is there a most efficient way? Well, I
I
mean,
mean,
the
there's
most efficient.
Tiger and Dragon's a model for it too. Like
Mhm.
I was at the gym today, and shout out to my new friend Patrick there, who's been a Mason for a long time, and works out with a great deal of focus and really carefully.
And you mean an actual Mason,
Yeah.
a
Um,
paid Mason, not a free one.
Bricks and such.
Right, exactly.
Stone. Yeah.
Yeah,
So we were talking today about the mind body connection, and I was just thinking about how elusive that is, and how much as you're talking about hermeneutics, thinking about there are amplifiers. Like if you get good at meditating, or if you get good at um,
right.
achieving a mind body connection, or you get good at first doing the first thing, or kind of a lot of the philosophical machines that we talk about, they kind of set you up for some receptivity and processing capability that you might not otherwise have.
True.
Martial arts. it cover hits a lot of those, not
Yeah.
all, right? So that's kind of where I'm coming from, and it reminds me that when we met, you kind of had this list of like, okay, if you want to if you want to get your shit together, here are some things you might want to do, right? You probably want to build your house or build something. You should probably do bagua. You should do some ceremonies, most of the time, not everybody. And uh, you should talk about philosophy. Those were probably like the main categories that I picked up from you way
Talk
back.
about, think about.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and given that everybody has their soul itch, and so that there is no one size fits all, which is exactly the point, right? It isn't the Tao is not churning out widgets, and the point is exactly not to make them all identical, right? I mean, and we have sexual reproduction, which is another way of that, and but also there's like, and this is where we start getting down to mind and the mystery of intentionality and of consciousness, or of awareness, before we get to all these things that we've talked about that are more impactable. Um, you know, when Freud was discovering the unconscious, he had this idea that he called, that gets translated as ego, but in German it's das Ich, the I. And the exploration of the I, what now there's these great scientific breakthroughs pushing for back the boundaries of understanding how the human brain works, but it will always bump up against a boundary that will be the mystery of intentionality and consciousness. And I don't think that that is what's meant by the ego now in current psychoanalytic jargon, but the idea of the I, or the witness, the you that, if you can remember at your earliest dawning of consciousness, that is the same as the you that still sits in the back, but there's so much more that's accumulated between that and the world itself that we call the semantic world. But in the beginning, when you're very young and you haven't yet mastered language, that I, that witnessing I, is much more bare, you might say. And then as we develop ways to interact with the world, we're actually building that that semantic world to give us handles and to make sense and to help us quest for certainty. And but the witness never really changes. And that all has to do with this mystery of the I. And so, I mean, I suppose that is the uncrackable nut. And, Federico Fagin mentions that he tried to explain consciousness with mathematics before he had the realization that it was not doable. And I think he wrote a book called Irreducible, which is this idea that there is no way that we can reduce consciousness and or intentionality down to matter. And that's when really we come up with this mystery of chi. How does intentionality within me communicate to move the meatware? Like, what's the connection there? We still don't understand that. We understand how the brain can activate the nervous system. We don't understand how the will, or the I, motivates the witness. Okay, let's see here.
So where were we?
Well, I think there was the question of how do we optimize our hermeneutics? Uh, and of course, the hermeneutics we're talking about is kind of expanded, because now it's not a text. Now, the whole that I'm trying to comprehend in my hermeneutic circle is the whole of my life. And each day, each experience, maybe not equally, but each piece contributes to that contribution to my picture of the whole and my understanding of the meaning that I can get out of the whole. So so the question then becomes, how do I optimize that? Well, the short answer is by being the you that the Tao was thinking when it you'd you, which we've said before. So how do I do that? Well, the clues are all over. And obviously your body is part of the clue. It's the medium for consciousness in many respects. It is the ass that bears us, so we have to come to some terms with it. Uh, there's there is this idea that I guess I always think of with the 10 bulls and seeing the footprints. And in the first bull, they talk about the whirring of the cicadas, which is the buzz of the world. And our
You've made
hero, yeah,
this Bulls reference before, but just in case somebody hasn't listened to where it's been mentioned before, can you connect
right.
that back to what that is, what that's about?
Yeah, this is not the Chicago Bulls, to get that fun fact out of the way.
Pamplona.
No, neither is it Pamplona.
Okay.
This is the bulls that come out of Zen Buddhism, and I can't remember the master that came up with them first. But the idea, I think they became more popular in the West when Cat Stevens came out with an album called Catch Bull at Four. Well, that four is the number of the 10 bulls. At number four is where you actually catch the bull. And so there's this idea that the bull is the Dharma, uh, or the Buddha Dharma, uh, which is to say that the teaching and the Buddha are sort of synonymous in a quasi mystical way. But the first step, the first bull is seeing the footprints. And then, you have to follow those footprints for a while and you glimpse the bull. Then, full on at number three, you see the bull. Then at four, you catch the bull. And catching the bull isn't the end of the problem, of course, because we have to tame the bull and we have to
Whole new problem.
whole new problem. And then once we master taming the bull, we ride the bull home. And then there's a series of passages where the bull is transcended and our self is transcended, and until finally these are all drawn in circles because they were wood cuttings. And finally, the ninth is an empty circle. Everything's been transcended. So the the everything's been put in perspective, you might say. And then they added later a 10th bull. There was originally only 9, and they added the 10th bull, which is called Back in the World, with the idea that this is almost like Finnegan's Wake, right? Where we go back where it started all at the end. And so so the point is, I guess, once first you have to have an idea of the bull to be looking for the footprints. But, I think some of us have, there is this Buddhist idea of a mind oriented towards enlightenment, uh, and that there is an element of us that is drawn to teachings and drawn to wisdom. And maybe with an instinct that the wiser we are, the richer that hermeneutical mix is that we have to vibrate against the world, or to have the world vibrate against, to resound within us, to wake up within us,
To participate, yeah. Yeah,
to
resonate.
participate. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. As that microcosm macrocosm deal is. So the short answer is like the New Yorker commercial where the guys climbed up to see the yogi who's sitting on the top of the mountain, and the yogi tells him, "Grow in accordance with your inner directives, you asshole." I think I've quoted that yogi before. And which is to say that we do have natural inclinations towards things, and there is the idea that I love today's rock and roll reference will be the Grateful Dead song, Wake Up to Find Out That You Are the Eyes of the World, called Eyes of the World. And this idea that the Tao is coming to know itself through conscious humans. And that's this idea of us being in God's image. Well, if consciousness isn't reducible to stuff, if it really is a down then up thing and not an up then down, rise and fall, if it really is a fall into matter and then a rise back up into spirit, um, then we're not going to be able to find that consciousness or intentionality is reducible to stuff. And our instincts, and you can have experiences where you don't need to make the arguments, you just see. But uh, so then what is that spark of awareness that is the deepest seat of consciousness that experiences? And what about that? If it's irreducible, where does it come from? Right? And the place that it comes from that is expressing itself through this portal has some ideas of what it wants to experience through this portal. And that shows up as maybe the karmic payload of that individual. And so it isn't about how to be like everybody else. In fact, it's exactly not about that. Right. It's about what is the thought? What was the world trying to see through your eyes that it made you its eyes? And that's the direction you want to grow. But I think that it puts in us likes and dislikes also that are not moral or value; they're just taste. Uh, so we find who we are mixed in the milieu that we're tossed into. And being that's the most efficient way,
Mm.
right? Running with the soul wind, a wing and wing, right? Which is a sail going out on one side and the other sail going out, and you got the wind at your back, and you're the fastest that ship will ever move. It's
Mhm.
wing and wing.
So, so maybe let's come back, kind of to close out this conversation about hermeneutics. Let's make the connection back to discourse and dialogue, because that's been like a
Mhm.
consistent, I think, mutual awareness that we're developing about how these conversations are evolving the purpose of doing this podcast.
Yeah. And philosophy ended up at that same place also.
Right. And then I've been doing the dialogue stuff. Uh you and Claudia were talking about discourse, and I think it's just coming up left and right. So
It is. It is.
what connections are you making between dialogue or discourse and hermeneutics?
Well, if our hermeneutics is clear, then we're capable maybe, and what do I mean by that? I mean that if we're not trapped in the smallest levels of if we're closer to that will to bestow than the will to receive, if we're if our consciousness is set free in that respect from the energetic impulse just to try to absorb everything into ourselves. Um, if we have released what Levinas might I only secondhand understand by his idea of totalizing that we'll get into more. I hope to have to explore that soon here with Claudia, who really likes Levinas, who was a student also of Heidegger, like Gadamer was. Um, but this idea, if I am a non-repeatable, non-ending decimal that is a unique infinity, and my interlocutor is also an infinity. And I think I just heard, what was it he was saying? He was talking about probabilistic theories, but he's saying basically that when two quantum when two quantum realities interact, something new is generated. And this idea, and I think it was Fagin, and although he's not the only person thinking this way now, um, but this idea, and this is where physics becomes relevant, is this idea of the difference between probabilistic and deterministic. Deterministic means everything's happened and I can calculate it all and I can determine all of the details around it. I can do the math on it. I can flatten it out into the finite worlds work. But when I'm in the probabilistic, right, when I'm Schrodinger's cat still in the box, and what I am is a probabilistic curve, right? That there's the odds that I'll be in this position and alive, or in this position dead, or in the, based on where on the curve it is. But we don't know which of those curves, which point on that curve is going to be reality when we open the box. Well, that's this idea of where free will and choice can enter into the formula. How is it that we're not, if we're if, and this is Stuart Mill also, John Stuart Mill, if human consciousness is entirely deterministic, then we shouldn't even be having a conversation about ethics, because there's no free will. What you're going to do has been determined already. And just the idea that you think you're making a choice, well, that's just because you're a fool. And all these other factors that are at work behind the scenes. And I'm not saying this is the case. I'm saying this is the argument that they want to make. Uh, that everything's deterministic. But I think, at least in higher experience, we can come to understand that everything isn't deterministic. I proclaim that free will is not an illusion. There are cases where it can be illusory, where we think we have free will and we don't. Absolutely. But the possibility for free will does exist. And it is something that we do experience. And these guys who are much better at physics than me, they connect free will with the collapse of that wave function. When the probabilistic universe collapses down into the determinist universe, now something has happened, and the cat is either alive or it's dead. Boom. Now we can talk about it. But free will exists in that probabilistic universe, because I might get up, but I might still sit here. I might scratch my head with my left hand or my right hand. Like there's probabilities there, maybe, sure, but that that collapse of the wave form is this idea of transitioning from the probabilistic universe into the deterministic universe of physics, where things are. But that's not where meaning lives. And meaning has no weight. It has no mass. So we can't calculate it. It has no vector. But no, you can't deny that there is no meaning. I mean, people do, believe it or not. There's some philosophical schools that do that. But this hermeneutical model that says that not only is there meaning, but there's meaning that resonates with whatever meaning you bring. It isn't just you're creating it or it's out there, but there is this relationship or vibration between you and the rest. And so then in discourse, when we get two of those, now we've got two probabilistic, because there's all sorts of things I might say, and there's all sorts of things you may say. And what I say may affect what you say, and what you say may affect what I say. Well, now who can calculate that? That's not calculatable. So now we can discover new things. But if we both were perfectly objective, if we weren't bringing subjectivities to it, could we discover anything new? I don't think so.
If we're both objective, we're the same. Yeah. So, um, so that's a fun way of thinking about it that I didn't have access to before. That what happens in discourse is the extent to which any participant is connected to how they're making meaning in the universe slash their authentic self, then the set of approaching authentic selves are refining one another in like this mutually evolutionary kind of process.
And they're building a language to do that. And they are, I believe, according to Gadamer or one of these phenomenologists, they're merging horizons, is the way that he says it.
Can you play that
Because,
out a little more? Visually, it's really interesting, but I'm not sure I'm getting it all the way to the ground.
well, because our two probabilistic universes build a bridge, and the meaning that we could pull out of any of the future was sort of based on that, that resonance. So now my future and your future are connected in a certain way if we've built a bridge and we built a language, because now our semantic worlds overlap there. And but I'm sure there's more to that, and that's why I want to get with Claudia about this. What is this merging of horizons, and what is exactly meant by these horizons?
I love that phrase. That's going to have to be
Yeah,
an episode title.
yeah, and this idea that because where do we end up with all of this is with ethics, which is again to do with the other. And now I've really been having this thought, uh, particularly because I have these three puppies, and you have this new puppy. Which and by that, I mean you look into these eyes, and this is an eye. This is an experiencing consciousness. This is the Tao trying to see itself, another pair of eyes on the world. But one's going to become a walking, talking human being, and one's going to experience life as a dog. And there's all these Buddhist ideas of like, well, if you're a really good dog, maybe then eventually you've made it up from barnacle, and so you might make it through politician into human if you keep climbing the ladder of consciousness, right?
Banker. Yeah.
Past bankers, past meter maids
All the
into
way to human.
human, all the way to human. And so what is the nature of that consciousness, and what is our responsibility to that as a fellow window on all of that? What do I meet through those living eyes that I don't meet when I look at a dead inanimate object? Uh, Something's there. And it's in that dialogue, that cognition of cognition, consciousnesses recognizing consciousnesses. Um, because there's that, with both the puppy and the baby, it isn't just that you're encountering these consciousness, this other, but it's entirely dependent on you. And it's glommed onto you in a way that you are part of its world. Whoa, what about that?
You're part of the nail. Yeah.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, in the room and the world, all the rest of it, the whole deal. And so yeah, what is the universe thinking? You know, this is what it's so back and forth. And then of course the ethics is because we found these puppies under a tree. And a tree in an arroyo where the coyotes run all the time, and they were just Snicker bars. It's like, wow, well, so somebody obviously wasn't feeling an ethical obligation to these other consciousnesses somehow. Why? Well, because somewhere in their semantic model, there was some other payout somehow, what Tim Leary would say, some game investment that they had, that they were playing. And so it was going to hurt their game investment. Right. So it's like, wow. And all we have here are two eyes, two eyes, EIE, onto the world of experience.
EYE. Yeah.
EYE, right? Yeah. What did I say?
EIE, which
Oh, okay.
I
Yeah,
know we're
that's
on
not a
Old
word.
McDonald's
Yeah.
farm.
Don't Google that. Yeah. Uh, and so So yeah, there's something there. And what we haven't even talked on about here is language and the mystery of language, because it seems that there is some intentionality. That was part of my mystery also, was why does this puppy glom onto me? What is it about consciousness that wants to encounter and connect with other consciousness? This is also the universe universing. Um, so this is connected, of course, to love. Well, what's that about? And what is my connection with these eyeballs in this little dog? And the emotional connections that can come along with consciousness. I mean, there's a lot there. There's a lot there.
Yeah, maybe let's see if in our next episode we want to take a run at connecting language up to ethics and hermeneutics and making a
Mhm.
little more of a philosophical and psychological machine out of that. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, language is a huge thing. We made reference to it in one of our episodes, previous episodes. And I think that we surmised that there were probably several hundred languages, maybe as many as 1,000, that are still extant and spoken on the planet. Turns out it's closer to 7,100 that are still happening, without talking about the ones that are dropping.
Yeah.
And which is a pretty interesting thing, is a fundamental drive. I always wonder about that when I think about Bandelier, who was a polyglot. Who here in New Mexico we have the Bandelier National Park, which is a cliff dwelling. And Bandelier wrote an interesting book called The Delight Makers, which is a fictional book about what it would have been like to live in that. It's called Frijoles Canyon over by Los Alamos, and as to what life would have been like for them. Well, in the beginning of that book, one of the guys who wrote a foreword talks about hanging out with Bandelier and saying that he went to the Pueblos with Bandelier, and he was there about 4 hours, and at the end of which Bandelier was talking to the people in the Pueblo in their language. And he was, like, I don't know, famously fluent in 70 some languages. So it seems to me, when you hear about that, there are these people that they call them polyglots, right? Which is also a word used for a language that's made up of a few languages. But it makes me think, okay, they've clicked onto something. Like there is some sameness that enables them, like they've got a big gestalt in their head, and they're just changing pieces now somehow. Like they're and that's why they can do it with such facility. I mean, that's my
Yeah.
theory. I haven't had a chance to study them, but this idea of the impulse to linguisticality, that's a Gadamer word, linguisticality. And when we make the argument, as does David Bentley Hart in All Things Are Filled with Gods, or Full with Gods, uh, when you make the argument that consciousness is irreducible, you come to the foundational metaphysical role of language, which is related to, like, I noticed one of our episodes was labeled in Arche Hologos. In the beginning was the word, and this idea that mind is actually fundamental.
That would be this episode.
Oh, okay, that is this episode.
Yeah.
Okay, that was the first half of this episode. That's right. Well, see, that is this idea that it isn't, because there's different theories. Some people say that mind is an epiphenomenon, that when you get this complex mechanical system that they see the brain as, that it gets so complex and so complicated that it generates this epiphenomenon called consciousness. But the model is exactly the opposite, that it was consciousness that was the I don't know if it's technically a strange attractor, or, like, we know what the pieces of a cell do, but we don't know what gives it its cohesiveness, right? Well, that is the mind dynamic. And the argument that Hart makes, David Bentley Hart makes, is that mind is fundamental, and it is, by fundamental, I mean primary. and that materiality sets on mind. Without mind first, well, mind and language are inseparable. That's the meaning of this in archeologos.
Mind being the ultimate coherence.
The ultimate coherence and the sense that things can make.
Hmm.
Uh,
And therefore, the universe makes sense. Therefore, materiality can exist.
and language and linguisticality
Yeah,
can,
yeah.
because linguisticality is woven into the mix as, and that's where, there's, I guess they call it panpsychism, to say that, well, everything is God consciousness, but this is a little different to say, because that's sort of a co-emergent idea. This idea of, consciousness emerging out of matter, but this is different than that. This is consciousness precedes the materialization of things. And so so I mean, that sort of becomes uh, the 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 foundation for the intelligibility of the universe. We don't have that presupposition when we're in Descartes' mind saying, well, I only know what I think. We're in a different place metaphysically, because we're saying that I not only do I see for the universe, but I think for the universe, or the universe uses me to think, just like it uses me to see. Which doesn't mean that I sometimes don't think things that aren't true. Sometimes I mistake the rope for the snake, is the famous Buddhist example. But still, within that process, that's this idea, right? So mind is immanent in things, or predisposed, or pre-existent to it, and language then becomes this,
Kind of the medium.
a quasi-mystical kind of a medium, because meaning needs language to exist, right? And so we get, there's a whole thing that goes in there, the difference between syntax and semiotics. Semiotics being symbology. Uh, and so the symbol, the things that the individual uh, chicken McNugget of meaning needs syntax to be associated with other McNuggets of meaning, but the semiotics is the content within those,
So,
the
so
symbology.
each proposition you're adding here is a whole thread to explore. So, I think we should put a lid on this one, and we have 2 or 3 episodes of material, I think, in the questions that just came up, that I think we should come back to,
Well, and I think that these will also come up maybe with Claudia in our next episode with her,
for sure.
because the phenomenologists are definitely all about languaging, and then particularly when we get into Levinas, about ethics and that relationship with l'autre, the other, which we've
Cool.
also kind of unfolded a bit.
Good. So, yeah, looking forward to seeing her again, and to continuing this exploration. And yeah, a lot of big words, but the key for us is to try to try to integrate them with like how we're making meaning even in real time. So,
Right.
yeah, that was great. Thank you.
And that's what's been kind of fascinating about this, because we didn't say when we started this, let's start having conversations about discourse. And, we sort of just started having conversations. And it's almost as if this idea of things moving an ethical direction, or a discourse oriented direction, was sort of the meaning that was sort of hanging in the air, that sort of precipitated out of these different conversations, and through our interactions with other people, which is kind of an interesting thread.
Yeah.
And I think we can see how today there is a new place for discourse. And it may well be that these problems that we have can only be solved by using these new tools.
Good.
for discourse.
Yeah.
So
Well, let's find out. Thank you,
sounds
Brian.
good to me. Okay, we'll see you then.